much. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So now, we've been talking for quite a while leading into this, and it's been a lot of fun. But I want to back up because I want to, first of all, introduce you to everyone and have that thought. We kind of, it's kind of funny because you started, cut your teeth in technology and things in Ottawa, Gatineau. And I was thinking about that today because as we were talking, and you were talking a little bit about where you were living and things are going on. I spent so much time in Ottawa myself at two universities there, at Carleton and at the U of O, and living in that valley. Oh man, as winter's coming along, date stamping this a little bit, as winter's coming along, and we're both here in Dubai, we both have smiles on our faces.
Yeah. That's pretty inside for anybody. Ottawa has some pretty extreme conditions, like probably plus 40 in the summer with humidity, and you can touch a day in February at minus 40, and when people say that sounds cold and having experience, it's just a different thing. I mean, cold stops at around minus 20. At minus 40, it's like Dubai in the summer. It's just a different thing that you have to experience.
Look, we want to talk about your book.
Sure.
But before we do that, I want to back up a little bit because when I think about you and I think about the book, there's a little bit of a line there. Let's say a line in the sand where something happened, and I'm not talking physically, but really mentally, there was a shift. You started off your career, and I started reading, I'm reading about this phenomenal company that you and your partner set up. Here you were neighbors. You got patents galore, and I started reading about the company. I started reading about what the patents were, and I'm going, oh, this makes total sense. So, when we talk about tech and we talk about the aviation industry, and we talk about the fact that you got to have airports, you need air traffic controllers, you need to figure out what's going on, and in Canada and around the world, there's a lot of little airports that you can't afford to have an air traffic controller. And you guys set out to find a way to bridge that gap with technology, which begs the question, technology is your background. How did you get started in that world?
So I was mentioning earlier, my dad got me a computer when I was
remember what kind?
7 or 8. Well, there was the VIC-20, and then there was the Coleco Atom, which I think they only made about 30 of.
Coleco Atom.
So actually, it was
everyone's Googling right now.
Yeah, like throwback. And what was interesting about the Atom is there was really very little software for it. So you couldn't really, I think there was 1 or 2 games to play. And so in order for me to play a video game, at that age, I had to go to the library, get a magazine which had computer code in it, and I could actually. So I learned how to code by doing that way. So it's pretty
impressive.
Yeah, as you say that, I don't think it is. I think it's sort of like, especially when you're young, you can learn so much. I find when you're young and
necessity,
and also the nice thing about computers is it's just it's logic, it's rational, it's being rational, it's language, holding a lot of complexity in your head, being disciplined about and accurate and precise about how you communicate, with the computer. Which is interesting because it really influenced probably the way I perceive the world. I tend to be very precise about language, and I get irritated when people are speaking imprecisely, especially in the scientific and technology.
It's a problem.
I'm okay with I don't know. I'm okay with I think. I'm okay, but when you're sort of declarative about these global issues, it's kind of wild for me. If you're from the scientific, if you're in the mainstream and you want to say, pick your topic about the pandemic or climate or whatever, and you want to say that. But if you're in the scientific community, being humble, I think, is vital, and then especially in technology, because I think I've basically made a living off other people's arrogance.
And this becomes interesting because then we fast forward a little bit, and you're back in Ottawa, and you've migrated around a little bit. You spent some time in England, and you get back to Ottawa, your next door neighbor. Basically.
Yeah. It was funny because.
How did you guys meet? How does this exactly? You're mowing the lawn.
Well, it was. We were next door neighbor with some of these row houses, and I remember seeing him for the first time, and just thinking, he's Moody. So for people who don't know, my business partner, a fellow by the name of Moody Sheik, and. He's just such an attractive person, like just the personality. He's a handsome person. And I remember my first daughter had just been born, so this was 2000 where I moved in, and got to know him over the years. And I thought I would love. He complimented me in so many ways, because in many ways I'm like not an attractive person.
Oh, come on.
No, but certainly
yeah.
in conversation, and you know, my attitude, especially back then, I was, and even today, I can be quite challenging in a relationship. You know, again, coming back to the computer part. I can, you know, for me, being precise in a conversation is super important. But it's like when you're in relationships, what does precision matter, right? You know, like, did you really mean so?
Oh, yeah, I can see where this is going.
Right.
You must have had some interesting discussions.
Oh my God, yeah, all my life, and you know, and so it's always a challenge for me balancing that. But what I saw in Moody was this just an amazing, good-natured, good-hearted individual, and I thought if we ever teamed up, we'd make a really decent force in the marketplace. And so we did. We met in a Starbucks, and
as where all hookups happen, right?
Yeah. So we met in a we were friends. We had been friends for a while, but we said, well, let's start a company together. And so we sat in the Starbucks. We really had no plan. I was doing some consulting at the time in air traffic control. And by the way, just as it's International Civil Aviation Day today. And
is it?
I think that's, okay. If anybody, any of your listeners want to read up on the formation of ICAO, which is the global organization, it's one of the brightest spots, I think, in international collaboration, still going on today, and the history since 1944, the Chicago Convention. You know, just Google it, Chicago Convention 1944, and this idea that all these countries came together with the idea of knowing each other. That's all it was we got to create a more friendly place to really get to know one another, and that was the foundation of ICAO. So anyway, so Moody and I sat down in this coffee shop, and you know, aspiration to start a business, not too sure what. We had a few different options, and you know, I had the background in air traffic control, and his aspiration was he wanted to travel. So
all right, there
you know, there wasn't really a business plan. And
that's a start. You put that on a napkin, and you're ready to go.
And then we just sort of muddled our way through it, and thank God. And we were sort of in our early 20s, where there's just enough innocence and naivety that you think you don't actually. Technically, it shouldn't have been done. You know, like, it was sort of two guys with no money, no experience. We said, well, we want to change global air traffic. You know, there's a better way of doing it. And ironically, our first customer was Abu Dhabi. So we you know, the UAE is incredibly progressive on the world stage when it comes to innovation, and
which is amazing, isn't it? Because we both come from Canada, and we. You know, I mean, nothing against Canada and innovation, because there's lots of great innovation, but it's just slow.
It's conservative.
It's conservative.
Very
okay,
conservative.
I'm trying to be nice here, but you framed it nice. It's conservative.
It's a conservative culture. It's sort of, and what was interesting was we pitched it to what used to be Transport Canada, which was the governing the air traffic control agency, then Nav Canada, and asked for $10,000 investment to buy the hardware.
It's peanuts.
Yeah, and they said, you know, so again, it's one of these stories, but they said, no, you should actually try doing this in prisons or some sort of nonsense like that. And then Abu Dhabi became a customer, and one of the first countries to be doing advanced work in this field, in what you said earlier about the air traffic control tower. And our second customer became Germany, because we had to stop in Frankfurt on the way to Abu Dhabi. And so we ended up getting effectively sponsored by.
I heard a great story about this though. You're in Frankfurt. You literally have a meeting in the parking lot.
Yeah.
Because you say, hey, can we have a chat? And there's I'm here now. Let's go and have a chat.
So it's funny. I always wanted to do this. And anybody who's starting a business like this, I learned this from my dad. My dad was in sales. So when he wanted to have a meeting, he would drive to the place. Not ask for the meeting. He would drive to the place first, and then call from the parking lot and say, I'm here to have a meeting. Well, we kind of did the same thing. We landed in Frankfurt and called the sort of a government there and said, hey, we're here to have a meeting, and ended up getting this meeting. And then they sort of carried us for a couple of years to where we went back to Transport Canada, or it's Nav Canada at the time, and they ended up buying half the company. For a lot more than $10,000. So actually the shout out to it's an incredible organization, and I kind of understand now the conservatism. So I don't want to say that. I mean, there's a good reason. You don't want your airports and your air traffic control to be whimsical and fly by the. You know, it's a very disciplined industry, And
Well, I guess in a sense also, when I started looking at some of the things that were involved with what you did and some of these different patents that became a really big piece of what you did, I mean, this is a huge investment in, and I'm not talking financial investment, but an investment in, okay, we can do this with tracking systems and overlays on video and all these things, so that essentially, as I was reading it, I'm going, you can have a remote air traffic control system set up here.
Oh, there are, and that's happening today. So fast forward 20 years from when we started, the company, so Nav Canada bought half the company back in whatever it was, 2010 maybe, and then the other half got bought by the UK Nats, which is the national. So essentially, we had two governments owning the. It's not quite, they're not quite government, but so two institutions owning this tiny little tech company in Ottawa. We had about 30 different countries around the world. So Singapore today is going to actually have a digital air traffic control tower. So fascinating journey. I got to experience customers all around, like cultures all around the world. Now, that's sort of what fascinated me was I love learning about culture and history through the eyes of the people I meet. Particularly, I like talking to old people. Like that's always been my thing. And particularly at the time in the last 5 years, where I was getting less and less settled in this was the year of U.S. politics being a little wobbly.
Yeah.
Again,
That's a pretty conservative statement there.
Yeah, this is my new thing. I was being very generous the way I try to be very generous the way I speak. So we'll call it the U.S. politics being very wobbly. Pre-pandemic, you sort of had a lot of things going on in the world, and if you're catastrophizing, if you say in the 1940s, there was really only one way to really blow things up, and it's sort of if you know enough about, not to scare any of your listeners, but if you know enough about technology and the decentralization of a lot of things, what's happening is there's about 15 good solid paths to self-destruct right now. And so the place I'm at is I'm very I just the way I perceive the world, you can kind of look at paths and say, okay, well, how is this path going to end up? And you sort of look at decentralized gene editing, and you're like, oh, okay, well, where's that going to go? so I was getting more and more unsettled, and then I was traveling to China. I was meeting with these, I was sort of ascending in my career, so I was meeting reasonably well-connected executives, and hey, what's your take on what's going on? And they're looking at me with wide eyes and a blank face, and I don't know either. And I felt
that's scary.
Well, what was interesting was it was the same experience for everybody across the board. And so I'm meeting people. The common themes were there's a generational thing happening here, and I think it's bigger than generational. I think it's something that only happens potentially every few thousand years, even more. As you sort of the way he was. So if I look at my grandparents, so my granddad.
So we're backing up here, just to reframe this, because you're talking about how you really love meeting older folks.
Yeah. So
I would
be so one of the meetings in particular, and it's just loosely mentioned in the book, was a fellow in Hong Kong, and who was probably about 20 years, 30 years my senior, so he was a grandfather, and he was talking about this transition in his culture with this generation coming up, and that transition he was talking about was very much what was happening in Canadian culture, I think in U.S. culture, basically around the world, probably in African culture. And it's something where if you sort of point to, say take anybody's grandfather right now of our age, but that generation, they probably live the same way as their grandfather and on and go. I say grandmother as well. Whereas this generation coming out my experience on this planet is nothing like my granddad's experience, and whoever's coming after me is going to be nothing like mine. So we're living in this era of acceleration and change, right?
Absolutely.
And that was sort of a thing. It's like, oh, so the ground beneath all of our feet is shifting, and I became kind of fascinated with this underlying thing of, hey, what's going on here?
Well, this becomes really interesting because you framed this beautifully. As I was, getting to know you online and learning, who Alex Thomas is and the entrepreneur and the technology and all of these really cool things that you were doing, and I can see it ramping up. And as you said, the investment in the company, and I mean, this is a wonderful story. Like you're that entrepreneur that everyone wants to be. And I stumbled across a few quotes. and I'm just gonna I actually pulled them a little bit, and I've condensed them. But the thing is, there's a point where I'm looking at you
Yeah.
as you're represented online.
Okay.
Because we haven't met.
Yeah.
We haven't spoken to each other.
Right.
And then I'm framing that with your book.
Okay.
And I'm going, hold on a second.
Yeah.
There's something going on here. And that's where I want to pick this up, because here's the 3 quotes that really, I think, and I've taken pieces of them here, but they really frame who you were versus who this book talks about who you are.
Right.
And that's where I want to pick up our conversation after these quotes with the transition. What happened?
Sure.
And there's 3 quotes in particular. And I take these quotes as I'm looking at them and I'm thinking about them as the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And talking about business and talking about how we live in this world. And the first one is, you don't look backwards often. And as an entrepreneur, you don't look backwards. You just keep looking forward. You keep looking where you're going. The second was, keep running.
Keep running. Yeah.
Keep running. Don't slow down. Don't look back. Keep running. And the third one is, the lesson is, make sure you commit to the right thing.
Yeah.
And I get the sense from your book, and looking back at where you were, that there was a whole point where you were running, you weren't looking back, you weren't really seeing where things were going, and possibly you had that moment, and you talk about it in the book, that what do we call it, divine? I think of it kind of like a divine intervention. You got the right, but you got that moment where everything sort of crystallized, and you were in England, and it all crystallized, and you went, oh.
Yeah.
And I when I read that, and I thought about this, are you latching onto the right thing? It was like, at that moment, you realized, I'm not latching onto the right thing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because you're bringing up some interesting quotes that I haven't seen in a long, long time. And I mean, there's 2 things. One is the person that is online in the business versus the person in the book. It's in the book, it's just me standing naked. I mean, that's effectively, like, what was interesting to me was if I'm going to do anything, I want to drop, open the commode. This is who I am on the inside. And I think, because I think what's interesting about me is how uninteresting in a way I am. I'm so banal in so many areas of my life that I think that experience is so common. I think the questions I have are the questions most people have in some way or another. And the running part was interesting, because there's a quote early in the book where I talk about running from wolves, and it's like, I think I said I was shot out of the womb 45 years ago, and that's what it felt like. Is you sort of land on the planet, and there's all these people running, and you say, hey, why is everybody running? And they said, don't ask that question. They just keep running with us. And then he said, no, you've got to go to school. Well, why do I got to go to school? Well, because you got to learn how to survive. And on it goes.
You're just we're just really being trained to sort of become part of this, our society.
Yeah, so I think a lot of, and it was funny because that influenced me a lot how I raised my children, was to almost protect them from education. Like protect them from, when you have a young mind like that, it's sort of, I think philosophically, and I don't know what philosophy this would fall into, but I have a sense that if you said, compared yourself to a tree, which is pretty basic. But if you said, like, I'm in this body, this is a tree, and I'm more or less like a tree, what does the tree need to grow? Like, it needs water, and it needs, and I think it's a lot of the same thing with people. I think everything you need to know, you've got everything inside already. There's an unfolding that's going to happen that doesn't necessarily need to be questioned, but just sort of, it needs to be nurtured, right? That sort of unfolding. And I think a lot of what we do is we intervene in a lot of points in life when we oughtn't, and so I think that was this sort of questioning, as I think probably happens to a lot of people around that period in the 40s, where the kids are old enough now where I have time to question. I'm not dealing with diapers, I'm not dealing with crisis after crisis, hockey and all the rest of it, where I can actually slow down. And what was interesting, I think, was my kids we're at that point, we're heading into adulthood, and it's like, what is it that I can now give them as a father that will prepare them for life? Like, what's that one thing I can tell them? Like this sort of, and there's this desire as a parent to say, look, here's the project. What I got when I was growing up, work hard, go to church, take care of your family. And if you do that plus or minus, you get a C in that, you'll be happy, And I did that, and I didn't feel like I was getting a C, I felt like I was getting an F, and it was sort of this saying that none of this feels right to me, and I stopped buying into what I'll call the project, where we go around the Monopoly board, pass go, make another 200.
But you're the entrepreneur. You're
Yeah.
living the dream. You're meeting up with execs in the parking lot. You're signing deals.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is like I actually launched a company yesterday, and that drive hasn't changed, but the understanding of that drive is there, and the why I'm doing it is really important. I think that was what was missing. Is that, you could be doing the same thing and have two different kind of motivation. I think understanding that motivation behind why you're doing things, I think, and achieving a level of clarity in your own. And for me, what I was looking for is a level of clarity.
So what was the point where that clarity, where you got that clarion that just sort of said,
yeah,
here it is?
Well, there's definitely a point in the book. We'll call it kind of an illumination. But I'll take a step back, because what
I'm also curious. What was the motivation? What made you say? Because we could look around here, and we could you sit in a coffee shop, and you see 30 people around tables. They've all got a book in them.
Yeah.
But none of them are writing the book.
Yeah.
You had the book in you that had to be let free.
Yeah, I did. It was funny because there's a couple of things. One is I've been fascinated with the mystics. I'll say that as sort of a broad term without really overly defining it. But let's take Buddha as sort of the least controversial in the names you could probably put out that have a certain special quality to the way they think. And I've been fascinated with that since I was a child, before even programming. So there's something innate in me that was drawn to that, and then I sort of, if I talk about, and I want to be careful with the terms I use. I'm going to use a lot of terms loosely here, but I'll talk about enlightenment. That for me is a process. It's an engagement. It's a dedication to a certain path and a set of practices, and I think some people will be drawn to that. Some people aren't. Some people, if you're drawn to hunting or farming, you know what I mean. I think there's sort of it's not to say it's a better path, or it's just
everyone's got their own.
Yeah, for sure. And that's so for me, I had that in me. This sort of desire, like the kind of stories that would intrigue me, or that would be the mythological or mystical ones. These sort of. If you wanted to spend the next 5 hours talking about something in the Bible, I'd be fascinated by that conversation. It's to me, that's just an area of interest for me, and it always has been. And probably as I became a dad, I became more, how do I actualize this?
Which is a question everyone has, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of like, you have a lot of people talking about, you've got religious figures today that are fairly prominent in every sphere, and some of that conversation is noisy. Again, I'll be
well, I mean, and the noise comes from we attach definitions to everything.
And it's also what's really interesting, especially after having written the book, is when you get into the sort of mystical space, you're now beyond language. So now if you understand that, and you go back and read biblical or anything in the Bible, or a lot of the Buddhist teachings, or any of them, because they're all really talking about the same sort of thing. What the issue is they're trying to bring somebody in language to a place that's not in language.
Right.
And that's definitely challenging, but it's also. For me, when I sort of committed to a path, when probably in my early 30s, when my kids were starting to get, and I'm like, I want to actualize this. I want to become the most loving version of myself that I can be, daily. And it's a challenge, because I'm not a loving guy by default. I wake up in the morning very competitive, very, and I've kind of a great relationship. Thank God for sense of humor, right? So my kids all have a sense of humor, so we don't take each other too seriously. And my son the other day says to me, we got in the car together. He says, "So who we got in the car today? Jesus or the devil?" So he picks up on it. So in a way, and we can laugh about that. But there's definitely this thirst that I've always had for those sort of. And what I did notice is once I committed to this kind of unfolding, or this learning, is in the spiritual kind of space, I started to weed out, this is an interesting teacher, and you kind of start going, and I'm sure it's the same, like I said, I haven't been to school, but I'm sure it's the same in school, where you start to see, well, this teacher doesn't know what they're talking about, but this one does, and you kind of gravitate. And then I noticed a few years ago that I wasn't finding a lot of teachers anymore. I kind of got to a point where, I think I'm near the end. And if I do think there's a progression in this, and I do think that, a little bit like karate, I think it's not quite, a belt system, but I think there's ways of perceiving and interpreting life and actualizing this in your own life. And there is a sort of high point to that journey. And I felt that was coming. And when I started writing, probably even though I couldn't articulate it at the time, when I was moving to Dubai, I felt that that point of illumination was coming. And I said, well, I want to start writing. And when that point of illumination comes, there'll be an interesting story in there somewhere. And the point of illumination did come. I probably accelerated a little bit, partly because I think some of the modern era is very difficult to, if you could sit 6 hours under a Bodhi tree, I don't think the Buddha in 2022 sits 6 hours under a Bodhi tree. You know what I mean? I think it's just the dynamics of the way we receive information, the way our brains, I think, have fundamentally changed in the last century. So I think to sort of achieve that level of deep consciousness, it's much harder today than it would have been 1,000 years ago. So I felt that point of illumination coming. And I'm saying this with a certain amount of hindsight. I wouldn't have been able to articulate that when I started writing. But I started writing. I was writing about the upheaval that was going on in my culture, the lack of sort of direction that I could give to my children, and that something spiritual is going to happen here. You sort of have this feeling, and we're moving to Dubai, and Dubai for me is a very spiritual place. I know for a lot of people it's a tourist.
A lot of people think very differently.
Yeah,
I sometimes wonder if it's not, we attach the name Dubai to the entire country. Yeah. And I'm sure your experience is like mine. Is like, yeah, there's a portion of Dubai that is tourism based. There's a
for sure.
But you drive 12 minutes down the road and you're in a very different space.
Oh, for sure. But it exists on a substrate of Islam. And you can't go, I was mentioning this to a reporter the other day, is I'll be driving along the highway and I'll see a person pulled over to pray, praying into the sunset, and that moves me. So you're seeing, or you'll be in a meeting and says, well, we got to stop the meeting, I got to go pray. And so it's normalized within the culture here, and I crave that, because that's something that I think Canada, when we talk about some of the changes in the culture, I think the sort of secular movement glossed over a lot of treasure. There's this sort of a almost you would get ridiculed a little bit, politely, but it'll be this sort of, if you were to say, look, I'm going to go pray, there's a sort of diminishment of that, but it's actually, to me, it's the sort of the highest form of living. And it took me a while to get to that place. So I kind of wrote the book with that intent. It was sort of, look, there's a lot of people that are secular right now that have written off religious practice, and so you can read the book without really knowing it's a book about spirituality and religion. I think, other than a couple of parts, like it's not overt. It's the way I like to sort of express this, because I think
when I was going through portions of the book, I definitely got that feeling that it was there, and you could interpret that way. Or depending on where you are in your own path, it could be taken a completely different way.
For sure.
Both of them offering the similar message, but how you're interpolating things.
I think that's, to me, it's the book I wanted to read probably 10 or 15 years ago.
Isn't that the key? You wrote the book you want to read.
Yeah. To me, it's like, if you sort of look at, again, we'll take some of the big figures without mentioning any. I don't like naming the names because it gets people comfortable. We'll just say that the mystics, and I mean, there's been saints, you read some of their writings and you're thinking, man, these people were scintillating with love. Like that, we can say that. Like they had a love and understanding of humanity that was just scintillating. And I'm like, but when you read the snippets of them, so you see a Buddha, for example, and you think, well, man, that guy was every day happy and joyful, and you're like, and I'm like, no, he wasn't. Show me the moment the Dalai Lama stubs his toe. I want to see that moment. I want to see the humanity, and what's needed. Some of the biblical stories in the Gospels, you see that a little bit in the portrayal of Jesus, where he gets really upset with the tree, and now modern interpretations of all kinds of things. But if you actually just look at it in the story form, you say, well, there's a guy who's hungry, who comes and there's a date tree and there's no dates. He's upset. So to me, the beauty is in capturing both ends of the spectrum of divinity, is the savage and the divine in the same person. And I tried to convey that in the book, because there's a part of me that's incredibly aspirational, and in the right moment and on the right day, it's magic. I can say something or feel or express
This
something.
is your son in the morning getting in the car.
Yeah, right. I can be so incredibly polarized, and because I say that because I think it's the same thing with everybody. Is there's this sort of this butterfly trapped in this body of a monkey, right? And I think there's something beautiful about that. This sort of I'll say, like, sometimes you'll hear talk about the divine as sort of an expression of I am, and to me, when you think about I am, it's just this exuberant statement, and you say that, this fabric of everything we experience is a fabric of exuberance, right? I just am, and I think there's something so romantic about that you look at our relationships. Nothing is meant to work easy, right? You look at a man and a woman and the asymmetry in that relationship, and how much love you need to get through a few years of marriage, let alone a few decades. Because that's the only path through it. Because it's not, it's so much easier. I mean, any for guys to get along, or for you'll hear about a girls' night out. Just it's so much easier in a way. And then, but to sort of be consistently in that one entanglement for a long period of time, it's just designed not to work, right? So you think to overcome that and to sort of let go, that to me, the book centers a lot around relationship as well, and that asymmetry, and this idea of I use my grandparents kind of metaphorically a lot, but where they had got to 50 years of marriage plus, and just this fascinating couple, but the intensity of that love that they felt for each other, and I tell a lot of people, especially young newlyweds and things, that I don't think the love comes until 5 or 10 years. I don't think what you're experiencing right. I think you're experiencing exuberance and desire and passion, the excitement about maybe having kids or going on these adventures. But I think the love comes when you're looking across from each other, and the first response, I cannot stand the way you eat your cereal. That's the start of your journey into love, right?
Yeah.
That if you commit to that, and then because you have to, this idea of marriage is, you have to give up a part of your identity for the whole, right? And that's your first kind of, and if you do that, and it's hard to give up part of your identity, you're giving up part of your freedom, you're giving up, and sometimes a lot more the longer it goes. But if you do that, it's the end product, that unified kind of couple, occasionally when one makes its way through, I feel like anybody that has this beautiful relationship, for me, like we all should all pause, right? We should all sort of pause and celebrate, and it's no diminishment to anybody who doesn't make it, because most don't, It's so when we do see it, that's something worth celebrating,
Yeah, it's funny because just what you're talking about, and this, just a side note, but I think about those couples and the enormous pressure that they put on everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's in a sense, it's, we've made it. We've found the way to accept each other and take on. And as you said, so many don't make it.
Yeah.
And you got your own kids who are looking at their relationships and going, how'd they do it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think, when you think about the book,
Yep.
and you talk about this butterfly in a cage, and this butterfly being let free, and that's what helps to, that freeness being, looking around the world and looking at what's going on and thinking a little bit more about it outside of the structures of our societies.
Yeah.
Do you think, in a sense, this book becomes that invitation to people to start doing this?
I hope so. Because I think what I wanted to do is illuminate the path, my own path, through just a way of storytelling of here's all my accidents and mistakes and mishaps, and but there's some incredibly loving moments as well. And I think that's the commitment, is the sort of, the very least you get when you get on this sort of religious, spiritual, mystical path is you're increasing your net ability to experience love. Like that's sort of what. And when I think about culture today, particularly in the West, is how many people are walking around today that have never experienced love? So you take a couple of parents who are just graduating with debt. They have a child. Mom, after 24 hours, gets kicked out of the hospital with a plastic Perry bottle and a box of mesh underwear, right? And so she's alone. And then dad is sort of, so we've got a situation. So it starts under duress right off the get-go. And there's information assault on everybody. All these choices about this is right and this is wrong, and you should feel this way or that way. So we're under siege in a way with information. And how does that translate into nurturing for the child? So we've got a generation of children that have grown up today that have experienced what in any other era would be a shock to the consciousness in terms of what they've seen, what their senses have taken in online, and things that they should have never, and so, and then there's a frailty that goes with that if that's what the world outside me looks like, where there's these barbaric and wild kind of things that happening, you kind of go inside, like, I don't want to be any part of that. I kind of, you join a cult, or you just find, you find yourself strong. But I wonder about that. How many people have never experienced love? How many people have never experienced what I'll even call reality? Like, how many people have never been in a forest? And I think that's something that I hope that if people do see this, do read this book and get a little snippet, especially as parents, that if you get on this path, there's so much in there. And even if you don't need to get to some point of illumination. I'm obsessive, like like I'm a high drive person. So if somebody talks about a mystic, I want to know more than the mystic, and I'm committed, and I'm arrogant enough to think I can. And so, but you don't need to get to that point. You'll get a net increase in your ability to experience love on day one.
I'm interested in the pandemic.
Yep.
And the role the pandemic played in this book, because there's that pre-post future thing going on.
Well, it's interesting. Like, if you want to talk like interesting. I think it was Jung that talked about divine synchronicities and things like that. But you've got like two phenomenon going on, and I'm going to draw something here that's not. We're going to get a little whimsical here, but you've got the pandemic and the movie The Joker that released at the same time, right? And what's phenomenal about if you look at cartoon or comic books, you look at Joker as an interesting figure from, I think, the 30s all the way to now, and the different aspects of this character change quite a bit. And you look at the society at the time of how the Joker was portrayed. Everything from outright villains, psychopath, to somewhat sympathetic anti-hero, to in 2019 the hero of the movie. And what's he heroic for? Burning society down. And so you think, well, that's an expression of the culture that says, look, there's something we're not happy with the culture, right? And at the exact same time, you've got this pandemic. So they're both kind of like spreading around the world at the same time. One's an idea and one's a virus. And it almost, I felt like it bought us some time. I felt like we were racing towards a cliff edge, frankly. I certainly, it was that's in part a projection of my own life, because I was racing.
You were racing. You weren't looking back.
I wasn't looking back. I mean, there was a little bit of venture, but in terms of my actions were in certainly there was a straight line and towards more. It wasn't, and so I think when the pandemic happened, Dubai was probably one of the best countries to have lived through a pandemic. And I think
absolutely,
I think shout out to the leadership here. I think it's been one of the most. I hope, by the way, if there's a book to be written about this period, that they do compare and contrast leadership and decision making across all these world governments, because I think Dubai nailed it across the board. The humility that they approached the entry point of this situation and all the way through. But anyways, so the pandemic. So we shut down for 6 weeks. Well, there's nothing going on for 6 weeks, right? And there's nothing, and in the book I mentioned you're captain of a ship that's not doing any shipping, what decision are you going to make today, boss? So global aviation shut down. And so it did give me a chance to reflect. And I think it gave a lot. I think we're hearing about the Great Resignation. I think that it gave a lot of people a window into family again. And it brought me to sort of, I think, back to the times where you and I grew up. And this isn't in any way a lament, but something important happened in our culture in 1992, and that was the end of Sundays. So Sunday, for people that weren't in Canada in 1992, Sundays were the worst day of the week as a child, because what Sundays was there was barely any TV on. I mean, we only had 3 channels. All the stores were closed. I think you had a few select pharmacies and dépanneurs that were open, and so it was either you went to church begrudgingly, if you were me, or you spent it with family,
or you went to church and then spent it with family,
which were so again, as somebody who was sort of fairly active, that to me always Sundays sounded like punishment. Looking back, I can string all of those Sundays together, and they were so warm. The texture of those memories is so warm and rich. And I think there are no more Sundays in North America. There's no more day in the week where there's a natural break where you're not, you know, if your kid's in hockey or piano, there's always movement, right? And so you get to sort of this ancient biblical wisdom that's thousands of years old, and it's across every culture about the importance of that one kind of special day. And the pandemic felt like a forced kind of Ramadan on the whole world. It was sort of like, you guys are going to like take a little time out here and think. And I think I'm one of many, I think, that will have had this similar kind of experience. And you see it on LinkedIn, you see a lot of people changing cultures. And so what was interesting in my journey was there was the book, and then there was a re-entry into what we'll call normal entrepreneurship, but with an accent, with a sort of a clear-cut drive and attitude that's in balance and harmony with my set of values now that are somewhat different than before the pandemic.
Where do you see it going? I mean, the book's done. You're obviously, you know, it ends, but it doesn't end. Where do you see things now as you're looking at what's happened, as you're looking at this re-entry process, this rethinking process? Where do you think I guess the leading question would be, do you think we've taken advantage of the time, or do you think we've squandered it?
I do think we've taken advantage of the time, because I think there's some, you know, again, if you catastrophize a little bit, it's not that difficult to project a few outcomes here that were pretty significant, you know, and there were some world events going on in 2019 that, if you're paying attention, were uncomfortable. And I do think there's a larger undercurrent. I'm, you know, eternally optimistic about this, but I think there's an incredible undercurrent with what I'll call the divine feminine. I think I see this swell of young women coming up that have something to say, have an experience. And if you look at across all the religions, predominantly they're male figures, right? And that's there's a huge difference between I think, a male interpretation, and even if you take sort of something like the Bible, where and you just read it in a feminine voice, the messaging starts to sound different. It sounds much more nurturing, and some of these things, you know. And I was telling somebody this yesterday. The difference between a father's love and a mother's love are very. The father's love can feel angry. It's still love, but it's coming from a place of, I need to protect you from you, right? Yeah. And whereas the mother's love maybe is a little more generous. And so I do see that happening. I think there's a groundswell there in just full stop, the divine feminine, and bring in that aspect, like leading the path back to a more harmonious kind of religious space, and across all the major outlets of this kind of thinking. And I think we're going to see a resurgence there, and I do think that the West in particular is in a period of transformation. I think there's a sort of, you know, it can't accelerate much more than it already is. The amount of change we're coping with on an almost daily basis, and massive change, right, in terms of disruption. So I think there's going to be a reckoning in that sense, and a positive one, in the sense that these institutions need to come down. I mean, we look at the media, right? Well, and this is all due respect to some amazing journalists. The media model news media particularly doesn't work. So we've got to reckon with that. Now you see these outlets coming out, Substack, this sort of form of truth telling that is I find much more humane. Right? I mean, you and I met each other an hour ago, and there's nothing, we can express our truth, and if somebody wants to, if it resonates with somebody, I think that's phenomenal. Like what an amazing gift technology is in that sense. So I think we're going to see those kind of changes, decentralization of power. If you look at, you know, that's the one that probably has the most potential for the gnashing of teeth, right? Because you've got the Bitcoins and the sort of, you know, that kind of transfer of power has never happened before. Well.
How do you think the book could resonate with our high school graduates and kids in school? Because it's one thing you and I talking about this.
It was funny because one of the people I've connected most with so far were young women, and
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because the guys that I sent, what I originally thought who would read the book were my friends and colleagues in business, and almost universally flat response from my friends and my guy friends.
Which is odd, which isn't odd, but it makes you kind of go, okay, hold on a second, what's going on here?
I'm not talking about how to improve your golf score. I'm not going to tell you how to make more money. You know, like those are so if you're in that category, definitely don't buy that book. But I think one of the comments that somebody, it was a young Islamic woman who said, you know, I got your book. All I read is about women, Muslim women, fashion. I think it was something, and she said, and so I see this thing, and it's and she said you're this white guy or whatever, and I had no interest, and by the second page it resonated. So I think, and I had another young woman who was saying that she got closer to her parents after reading the book, and I think for a young person to see their parents, because I'm a parent, and to see their parents a little more humanely, to see that they're probably a lot more confused than you think they are. they're just sort of holding on, and they don't want to like put that struggle onto you, but to sort of so for young people who today, you know, the average young person today, I mean, they're coming out of this with more information, essentially individual power than at any point in history. Like the amount of empowerment that's available to a young person today to learn, to master. You know, you can learn oil painting and you know, and you from masters basically, like this. So you can learn mysticism from mystics. Like you can, you know, so the amount of what's available to a young person today is astounding. And so they're not, you know, an 18-year-old is not an 18-year-old anymore. You're just like what would equivalent be a 40-year-old person in any other century.
What's next?
Well, I definitely the writing. I'm passionate about writing.
You've got the bug now? Like you've got more stories that just
God, yeah. Stories and exploring storytelling. Like I think you know, it took really, the first version of this book was written in about 3 months, and then it took another 18 months of editing to really pare down. And that process fascinates me. So how to tell a good story, how to bring people from beginning to end, you know, that's an art form that I'd like to continue to. I'd like to try to master that skill. You know, I think I see great books, and I read a lot of the greats, and I think, wow, you know, to ascend to that level of communicate. You know, you're talking about communicate, but to communicate, and there's something special in a book that you can only do in a book, that you can't do in a movie, you can't do in conversation, and there's a little bit of that, at least some attempts at that in this book. And so that, but and the writing I like to do is grounded in this mucky reality that I have, which you know, so this, you know, when you sort of, when you see these mystical figures, also you're like, well, yeah, it's easy to be a mystic when you're sitting up on top of a mountain, or spend 40 days, but try doing it in 2021 when you're threatened on all sides by modern living and you know, these information assaults and the general anxiety that goes around with a caffeinated public, and you know, and you look at the amount of profit there is in sickness today, you know, and so there's like this huge incentive.
I know people just get overwhelmed and just like, I don't have time. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. And then
it's maximum agitation. And so to be what I hoped, like, it was to be a quiet voice in amongst this crowd, and that to sort of build people that enjoy that type of thinking and those kinds of perspectives, and so I've got a few things on the go from a writing point of view that I'm developing slowly, and I'd like to every couple of years release a, you know, almost the opposite of Twitter. Release one thought that takes me 2 years to craft into this many pages.
Which is the opposite of where the world we're living in, where everything is fast, on demand, get it out, get it there, and it's like, no, let's think about this a little bit, and let's take a moment to think about it as we're paging through things.
Well, I think that's a
right
style,
in the margins.
Yeah. So I think that's a style of action that has to come back. You know, you look at, you know, whether it's a Senate body, that's sort of the custodians, and I think there's a little bit at the time we're living through too. Is you've got for the first time, I think with the baby boomers, it was the first generation that they weren't really stewarding and aren't really stewarding. So if I look at my role as I head into my 50s, not quite there, but as I kind of head into that, what I ought to be thinking about is where are we planting the trees for the generations 3 or 4 down the road? What are the what can I do to help the institutions you know, be there for 30 or 40 years. And so when we talk about the new company, that's what I'm doing, is there's some things that I can do with technology that are still in that space of global aviation that will help preserve and extend the institution that gave me a good living. And I think that's a commitment that I have within that space. So, so yeah.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of fun.
Me too.
I got to say, this has really been exciting, and I look forward to having this conversation again.
Thanks, James.
And you know, maybe we can sit down and go through more pages of the book as well.
Yeah, I'd love that.
But exciting.
Thank you very much.
And we'll do it all again really soon.
Perfect.